All right. Hello, everybody. I will let all of the attendees sort of flow in here, but thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on the use of vital signs monitoring for heat stress mitigation. This webinar is brought to you today by the Work to Zero initiative at the National Safety Council. We are really excited to sit down and talk through this technology, talk through some different use cases, and how this technology is being used in the real world. So really looking forward to it and hearing from our guest speakers. I will go ahead and get started and run through some quick housekeeping items while everyone is sort of flown in. So today's webinar is going to be an overview of vital signs monitoring, particularly for the application of heat stress mitigation. So we will talk through some of the different use cases, the benefits, some of the considerations, and overcoming some of those barriers. Today's webinar will be available on the NSC YouTube channel within a few days of completion. So you will have access to the slides and access to all this information. But I also really quickly wanted to plug our white paper that is now available. So today's webinar is based off of some of the work that we did on this white paper, Best Practices in the Use of Vital Signs Monitoring for Heat Stress Mitigation. It is a brand new white paper available on our website right now, where we really dug into understanding this technology, what its capabilities are, what its functionalities are, how it's being used, and overcoming some of those different barriers and considerations that often come along with different technologies. Today's agenda is going to follow a very similar format. So we'll start with an overview of heat stress, talk a little bit about some of the risks and considerations. We will hear from Rob Summers of Perigo, who's going to talk about their heat stress program and talk about some of the general strategies that employers can take to ensure that their workers are safe in all conditions. Then we'll get into the technology overview, talk a little bit about what vital signs monitors are, what some of those benefits and considerations are. And we'll also hear again from Rob about how Perigo is using vital signs monitors in their facilities now to protect their workforce. Really quickly, I wanted to actually take it back one step. I'm interested in getting to know who's in the audience before we lead introductions to our speakers. So a quick poll should pop up on your screens. And I'm interested in knowing, are you currently using vital signs monitoring technology within your workplace? Yes, no, or no, we're looking into it. Interested in seeing who's in the audience and if you all have experience with the technology in your workplace. So hopefully you should see that pop-up come up and the answers should start rolling in. Give you all a quick few minutes. Excellent. So it looks like as of right now, most of the audience today either does not have experience or not currently using or are currently looking into that technology. So hopefully you find this webinar really informative. If you have any questions along the way, please just pop it into the Q&A chat and we will do our best to get to them at the end. If not, we can certainly follow up with you at the end. So with that, I will quickly run our introductions. My name is Kenna Carlson. I'm a senior research associate with the National Safety Council's Work to Zero program. I have been here now for about 3 years, and I will serve as your moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to turn it over to Zach to introduce yourself really quickly.
Hey everyone, I'm Zach Braun, co-founder and CEO of Slate Safety. We've been building devices for worker safety for the past eight years. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Zach. Rob, turn it over to you.
I'm Rob Summers. I'm the Global Director of Environmental Health and Safety for Perigo. And we've been using the devices for about 3 years from a heat stress standpoint.
Excellent. With that being said, I will pass it over to Zach, who will be talking about, give us a brief overview of heat stress and tell us a little bit about the risks.
Perfect, thank you. So I wanted to start by just defining heat stress. So NIOSH defines heat stress as the sum of heat generated in the body from metabolic heat plus the heat gained from the environment, environmental heat, minus heat loss from the body. And all that totals up to equal the overall heat stress. So again, metabolic heat is the heat generated from basically the physical activity. Environmental heat is heat produced from warm or hot surroundings. If you're outside, that would be the sun. Inside would be like an engineered process, such as like a blast furnace or a dryer tower or something like that. Heat loss from the body occurs through several methods as well: sweating, increased blood flow, and vasodilation. Overall, this sums to what NIOSH defines as heat stress. From a physiological perspective, heat strain occurs on the human body when it is unable to maintain a healthy temperature. When someone is exerting themselves, the body's core temperature rises due to their muscles producing heat. That causes heart rate to increase in order to cool the body by pumping the blood to the skin. As can be seen in this diagram, these factors control the body temperature, and if this delta in temperature is not controlled, the body is unable to dissipate heat quick enough, a heat-related illness can occur. Here are examples of some heat-related illnesses. As can be seen in this diagram, they can vary in symptoms and severity, from something as minor as heat cramps to something as serious as heat stroke on the more severe side. Now that we know what heat stress is, how big of a problem is heat stress really? The Bureau of Labor Statistics compiled this data showing from 2012 to 2022 that there was an average of 42 worker fatalities and an average of 3,389 workplace injuries per year attributed to heat stress. And this is increasing. Over that decade, the number of recorded worker fatalities increased by 64%, which means on average, each year had 2 more deaths than the year before. This increase is shown in that faint orange line on the chart. OSHA also cites heat as the leading cause of death among all weather-related phenomena, and it is more dangerous as 18 of the last 19 years were the hottest on record. That quote's a little older now, as I believe we actually just hit a new record last year. So now the last 20 of the last 21 years were the hottest on record. Finally, there was a study done by the Citizen, which claims that these numbers are likely a vast underestimation due to the varying nature of heat-related symptoms, lack of consistent definitions, and underreporting. One study estimated environmental heat is likely responsible for 170,000 workplace injuries per year, making it the third highest cause of injury if it was properly reported. They also estimated up to 2,000 workplace fatalities per year due to heat, making heat the top cause of worker death globally. In addition to the direct effects of heat-related illnesses, there are also indirect effects of heat stress, such as sweaty palms, fogged up safety glasses, disorientation, declined cognitive function, burns, increased physical discomfort, and sleep disturbances. There's also been a number of studies that have linked an increase in heat stress to an increase in just regular hospital admissions, as well as for mental health related visits. Now, how about occupational risk factors? These are 3 types of jobs that are most at risk for heat stress. The first group are jobs with harsh environmental conditions. There are 2 main sources. Like I was saying earlier, the heat outside from the sun or from an engineered heat process, such as a blast furnace, or what Rob will talk about in a little bit with the dryer towers for manufacturing. The second group of jobs are those with PPE that is insulated or impermeable. This is a problem because the PPE traps in the heat and doesn't allow the body to effectively cool itself. The third group of jobs are those where the work itself is physically demanding. OSHA identified 70 industries through their National Emphasis Program where these conditions occur. The primary industries listed include many that you would expect, such as construction, manufacturing, agriculture, steel, and natural resources and mining. And of course, there are many more industries where this type of work exists. These are just ones that are similar that I thought I'd mention. There are also important individual risk factors that can affect the level of heat strain experienced. One of the most important factors to consider is whether the worker is acclimated to the heat. But there are many other personal risk factors as well, such as age, the type of clothing or PPE that they're wearing, obesity, hydration status, pregnancy, alcohol or drug consumption, lower levels of physical fitness, and any comorbid medical conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, or high blood pressure. Regardless of the individual risk factors, NIOSH recommends instituting a medical monitoring program for all workers exposed to heat stress above the recommended alert levels. Now, what does the current regulatory landscape look like? Currently, there are no federal OSHA standards for heat stress. However, the General Duty Clause does provide provisions that require employers to protect employees from recognized hazards, including heat-related hazards. In 2022, OSHA released a national emphasis program where it announced that it would be intensifying its enforcement and inspections in 70 high-risk industries. Additionally, there are 5 states that have adopted specific standards. They are California, Colorado, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. There are also several other states that have pending proposed standards. Just as a quick aside, I wanted to point out that OSHA and NIOSH partnered together to release a nice mobile application as part of that national emphasis program, which shows estimated heat index values as well as associated hazard levels. Now let's break down the proposed OSHA standard in its current form. The proposed standard currently applies to all employers with 10 or more employees in the general industry, construction, maritime, and agricultural sectors. The scope covers both outdoor and indoor work where employees are exposed to hazardous heat conditions, including environments with inadequate climate control or heat generating processes and equipment. A significant component of the OSHA proposed standard is the heat index thresholds. OSHA's proposed standard introduces specific heat index thresholds that dictate actions employers must take to protect their workers. You can see the thresholds on this slide. Specifically, when the heat index is above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, employers must ensure that employees have access to an adequate supply of drinking water to stay hydrated, and there must be designated break areas to offer a respite from the heat. And then when the heat index goes above 90 degrees, there must be monitoring for heat illness. Employers are required to actively monitor employees for signs of heat illness. There must be mandatory breaks where workers must be given a 15-minute paid break every 2 hours to prevent heat-related health issues. And also, although not mandatory, OSHA does recommend recording wet bulb globe temperature because it takes into account radiant heat from the sunlight, as well as artificial heat sources and air movement, which heat index does not take into account. Another component of the standard has to do with appointing a heat safety coordinator responsible for overseeing the implementation and compliance with heat safety measures. The next part of the proposed standard revolves around creating a site-specific heat injury and heat illness prevention plan that includes an assessment and control measures. This is essentially requiring you to make a list of potential heat hazards at your job site and then perform the appropriate control measures to mitigate each risk. Next is an annual evaluation of that heat plan. Last is employee involvement. OSHA wants the heat illness prevention plan to take into account employee input. And obviously, this point is to encourage collaboration between the managers, supervisors, and the employees. As mentioned earlier, acclimation is a critical individual risk factor. This new standard includes a required acclimation protocol for both new and returning employees. For new employees, there should be a gradual exposure to heat during their first week of work to help them adapt to the conditions safely. This is also true for returning employees who must reacclimate. In this case, the definition of returning employees are employees that have been away for over 14 days. The final part of the proposed OSHA standard is a comprehensive training requirement. This states that all employees must receive training on how to recognize and prevent heat illness. It also states that supervisors must be given an annual training so that they can manage heat safety, and they also know how and can respond to heat-related incidents. Thank you for listening to this first part on kind of overview of heat stress. I'll hand it over to Rob to discuss a practical approach to heat stress management.
Thanks, Zach. Waiting for it to get control there. There we go. Okay. Just going to talk a little bit about the Perigo overall heat stress program and how we've integrated, the wearable technology into our overall program. We have two facilities that have been, obviously subject to heat stress. They're infant formula manufacturing, and they have dryer towers, box dryers, and very warm environments in those. We actually have a third facility that we have a heat stress program, but we're just in the early stages of implementing the wearable technology. But it's inside the dryer, it's about 140 degrees, just to give you an idea of the heat source that's creating this environment. Everybody that goes into these dryer towers have to wear these devices. And it's not moving. Bear with me for a second. Our original program, when we started this probably 8+ years ago, really focused on, I'll call it the heat framework, what OSHA and NIOSH have continually told everybody: water, rest, shade. It doesn't have to be super sophisticated, but that's really been their focus, and we covered all those aspects. Kind of getting that risk assessment, figuring out where we need to wear the devices, or where the have the right controls, different levels of control in place, and how do you monitor it, what task are we doing, the level of exertion associated with those tasks. And then when we do start getting in the higher temperatures, what are those work rest ratios, permit to work, and things like that. And then how can we cool people down, whether it's cooling areas, fluids, or all the above. And then kind of the education, and then of course the challenges associated with a lot of those things is how you do this for each individual, and that's again where the wearable technology has actually helped us out significantly. And then acclimation, I think that will continue to be an issue or a challenge no matter what, based on all the legislation, even the devices. This will continue to be a challenge for everybody to know when somebody is acclimated, because that's a individual thing in comparison to just flat out put somebody in the environment for a specific time and assume that they're acclimated. Slides are not moving. Okay, thank you. Devices, as I mentioned earlier, how do you know, that risk assessment process, identifying and monitoring that wet bulb globe temperature, whether it's a wet or waterless, but understanding your risk. You really do need to do that, and not, especially indoor environments. You don't want to rely just on temperature, humidity. Next slide. Thanks. So our permit really focused on that permit to work and making sure, based on temperatures and also adjustments for the different layers. Zach had a slide earlier that I thought was interesting. We have the heat source, we have the layers. Everybody wears Tyveks and uniforms, so increases the heat. And then we, have levels of exertion, walking up and down stairs, in some instances, doing physical labor in those environments. So, we try and account for all those things, in our permit of how many layers of clothing and what type of clothing or, PPE you have on. And then obviously that last part, what is the level of exertion? What are you doing? Shoveling, chipping away at things, or are you just walking up and down stairs? Next slide, please. Just an example again of some of the controls we have in place with our permit to work, and when we put people into that and start doing the work rest ratios, in all of our high heat environments. Next slide. And then from a, excuse me, just controls I mentioned earlier, cooling, we're doing a lot of different things around cooling. We have cooling rooms, for break areas in the dryer towers. We also have cooling vests. We have portable or removable air conditioning or airflow. We have the technology. We have a lot of different things that we put in place over time. We didn't have all these when we first started our program. We continue to add things to it. Next slide. Acclimation, I mentioned, this is a standard form for us, but again, I think this is one where, we're trying to work on technology to help identify what acclimation looks like so that it's personal in nature instead of the generic approach of, percentage of time day by day. Next slide. Next one. We've now gone from, these kind of visual boards to, we have TVs in a lot of different areas that I'll talk about. But again, we talk about the risk in the areas, the temperatures, we monitor continuously. Zach will kind of touch on it a little bit with technology, and I'll talk about it later about how we monitor temperatures and know when to implement our permit to work system, and that's all on TVs. And we kind of have a weather forecast based on temperatures and where temperatures are going to be forecasted so that people know what they're going into. So we try and communicate not only what's going on, but what may be happening in the future. Next slide. Example of the forms. And we have this digital again on those TVs. We talk about it in all the huddles, pre-shift, managing for daily improvement kinds of things. So we're always looking at and talking about heat and that potential exposure in the environment. Next slide. Those are our cooling vests. We have surgical vests. We're in the food related industry. So our quality groups, like most of you probably will recognize, quality groups have specific things that they're concerned about. And, food and the gels that were inside these devices were a concern. And we found a non-toxic version. It's a surgical vest, actually, that we use so that in case one gets punctured and leaks or whatever the case, and could interact with the finished product or a product, it's non-toxic. So we have the cooling vest, we have the monitoring, that's the waterless version. Then we have the wet bulb globe device there too. And then just different tools that are used, cooling packs, water, all those kinds of things available. And all of our floors of the dryer towers, they're 4 to 5 stories. So each level, we've set up cooling rooms now on each level so that we had that. We never had that before. We just had a control room where, some of the operators would sit, but we didn't have one on every floor so that people can take those breaks. Next slide. Those are the cooling vests that I was talking about. You can use them in CGMP areas for those of you that have quality groups that would be concerned about it. Next slide. And then we have what we call micro learnings. We've kind of focused in earlier. Zach mentioned a couple of things in the rules, and these are our micro learnings for each of the areas within our program, just again, from a training perspective, bite-sized chunks that fits into the overall program. But we need to make sure that we continue every year, throughout the year, to stress all these different things in the micro learnings. Next slide. So from a layers of control standpoint, we've done a bunch of things. We haven't relied just on the heat stress program. We have that written program, which again is very administrative in nature. We've done a lot of things around dehumidification to remove humidity, which also makes challenges for making the product. But we've done cooling. We have spot cooling where we can focus cooling, turn it on and off in specific areas if people have to do open up a dryer, a line or something like that, where they'll be working in the environment, changing a part. So we've installed in a few areas where we can have this spot cooling and do things with the HVAC controls, wet bulb globe monitoring. We have Bluetooth devices now for temperature that we've correlated to the wet bulb globe temperatures. We have the training, the permit process, which, to be honest with you, I'll talk later about it, but we are pulling people out of the work environment well before we get into the permit to work process in most instances. And we'll continue to work on ways we can improve that process more, which I'll talk about. Next slide. Next. The next slide.
Thanks, Rob. I think at this point, we are going to actually turn it over to Zach. But really great insights into some of the things that you are doing over at Perigo. Really important measures, and as we will talk about later, measures that cannot be ignored even if you are using these vital signs monitors. With that being said, Zach, I will turn it over to you to give us a little bit of an overview of the technology we're talking about today.
Perfect, thank you. So I just wanted to start with an overview of vital sign monitoring. Vital signs monitoring can be monitored with various tools, from highly precise lab equipment to more mobile wearable devices. There are also many different vital signs that can be monitored. On this slide, you can see 6 vital signs which are useful for measuring heat stress risk. Not all wearables will measure all 6 of these things. Some will measure a subset and others will measure a different subset. So it's important to keep that in mind. Vital sign monitoring involves measuring the body's physiology for these parameters that can signal heat stress risk. This consists of measuring for physiological parameters such as core body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, skin temperature, respiratory rate, and fluid loss. Oh, thank you. So why would you want to use vital sign monitoring? Well, there are huge benefits to workplace safety, such as the ability to tailor heat stress protocols to an individual. There are many reasons why, which I went over earlier with the individual risk factors, that why one individual may be more at risk of heat stress than another. With personal vital sign monitoring, we can identify the ones at higher risk and ensure they receive the help when they need it. The ability to receive real-time alerts if a threshold is surpassed, allowing supervisors to receive a simple text message or notification and be able to respond to risks before they develop. Finally, with vital sign monitoring, managers can have automatic access to useful data visualizations and insights. These insights can allow managers to recognize the types of jobs and environmental conditions that put their workers at higher risk and be able to manage those risks by implementing additional engineering controls, such as installing additional AC or stuff along those lines. Here's an example from our own Slate Safety wearable system. At Slate Safety, our goal is to use vital sign monitoring to prevent heat illness. One large way we help workers is by prompting them to take action and manage their own work-rest cycles. For an example, when a worker crosses their personal threshold, they receive an alert vibration directly from the vital sign monitor wearable device itself, prompting them to rest. Then after the work is done, then after the worker is done resting, they will reach their return to work core body temperature. They will receive another vibration, letting them know when they are clear to return to work. An example like this can be seen on this slide. You can see the workers increasing core body temperature, eventually hitting that red upper threshold, prompting them to stop work and cool off. Then once they were adequately cooled off, maybe through a break, they reached the green threshold, prompting them to return to work. Again, this is what our goal is at Slate Safety, and I'm proud to say that last year alone, we prompted over 7,000 automated heat stress interventions across our customer base. Now diving into the specifics of vital sign monitoring, there are really two different technologies that are being used today. The first vital sign that we're trying to measure here is heart rate. The heart rate can be attained via ECG readings, which measures the voltage of the heart's electrical activity. This is done by attaching electrodes to the skin, which measure the potential difference across the chest. This is widely considered the gold standard for heart rate measurements, and that is why it's used in hospitals throughout the globe. In more practical settings, the electrodes must be attached to the skin directly, which requires no hair in the way, so there would be shaving, and can be dislodged during high periods of activity. Another more practical way to measure heart rate is via PPG. PPG is an optical-based approach that measures the variations in blood volume under the skin. This technology is commonly used in consumer-based fitness devices, such as a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. Basically, how it works, there's a transmitter that you can see in this diagram. The transmitter, the red A in the diagram, shines light into the skin, and the receiver, the blue B, measures the amount of light that comes back through a photodetector. The heart rate is then extracted based on the relative change in the amount of light that comes back. Specifically, green light is often used in PPG sensors because it's absorbed well by hemoglobin, which is the protein in the red blood cells that carries oxygen. The next vital sign is core body temperature. Core body temperature is arguably the most useful vital sign for assessing heat strain. Under heat strain, core body temperature rises as the body's cooling mechanisms struggle to transfer excess heat efficiently. But what really is core body temperature? In general, when someone mentions core body temperature, they mean the temperature in the body's internal organs. This can be seen in the diagram on the right. Because of this, the gold standard ways to measure core body temperature are invasive. In a research setting, this is measured through the use of a rectal thermometer or an ingestible pill that sits in the person's stomach. Due to the impracticality of those methods, there have been other attempts at non-invasively measuring core body temperature. These non-invasive attempts, such as skin temperature, forehead temperature, and ear temperature by themselves, are all considered less accurate because they cannot reach the actual core body temperature. Again, as seen on the diagram, that red part does not actually reach the skin, ear, or forehead. But there is still a significant need to non-invasively get core body temperature. The US Army began this project through the use of several different inputs. For instance, they tried to map other measurements, such as heart rate or skin temperature, to the underlying core body temperature. This laid the foundation for most of the core body temperature sensor fusion algorithms seen today by several vendors, including ourselves at Slate Safety. In many studies, these have been proven to be more accurate than forehead, ear, or skin temperature measurements. Slate Safety specifically has partnered and is currently working with more universities to provide third-party validation of our core body temperature algorithm. The generally accepted industry standard, which almost all vendors kind of try to follow, is around plus or minus 0.3 degrees Celsius mean absolute error for their core body temperature algorithms. As you can see here on this slide, Slate Safety falls within that at 0.25 degrees Celsius MAE, mean absolute error. Overall, this shows that the sensor fusion algorithms such as Slate Safety's perform on par with the more invasive methods which have been deemed impractical to use in the field. Here's a quick diagram of behind the scenes of what the core body temperature algorithm studies are actually trying to do. The blue line here is a rectal thermometer, whereas the orange line is the Slate Safety wearable device. For preventing heat injuries in particular, the Slate Safety algorithm tries to overestimate rather than underestimate the core body temperature due to the inherent risk of heat stress. But you can kind of see these lines kind of tracking each other across the graph here. There's several different form factors for wearable devices that measure vital signs. I've linked an Army comfort study here, which ranks them in comfortability when performing physical activity. Going from the least comfortable to the most comfortable is an invasive ingestible pill that you must swallow, an ECG chest strap, ear-based wearable, arm-worn wearable, and finally a wrist-worn wearable device. While the wrist is the most comfortable, it is the least accurate due to the wrist-worn wearables not being worn tightly, having a high level of motion associated with the wrist, another degree of freedom there. You can think about with your wrist bending and glove interfacing. At Slate Safety, our goal was to choose a form factor that meets the sweet spot between comfort and accuracy. For workers, this sweet spot seems to be on the upper arm, out of the way of the gloves, and less of a distraction for workers. Finally, I wanted to share the study done by the US Department of Homeland Security, which evaluated 5 different vendors over several important categories. Oh, looks like I went too far. I don't know if you can go back for me, Kina. Perfect, thank you. Finally, I wanted to share this study done by the US Department of Homeland Security, which evaluated 5 different vendors over several important categories for vital sign monitoring, including capability, usability, deployability, and maintainability. Now I'll hand it back to Rob for a deeper dive into how they actually use vital sign monitors at Perigo. Thank you.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, this was the game changer. We had been doing, I'll say, the traditional heat stress approach, monitoring temperatures, permit to work, different controls, and we were still challenged. We still had events occurring. We've been looking for technology, and we came across Slate Safety. There's some great devices out there, other manufacturers, but we partnered with Slate Safety and Zach, but it really was a game changer for us because now that layer of control that I mentioned that was missing in that Swiss cheese model was something that was specific to an individual. All these other things were one size fits all, and you really didn't know what was happening to the individual. You didn't know their medical conditions, their personal medical conditions, their physical capability. Did they go out and party last night and get dehydrated? You don't know any of those things. You can't tell anything. And with these devices, we had better insight to what was going on with everyone. We started out, we had about 85 of the devices out there, in our work environment. Anybody that goes into the dryer towers, they wear them, they check them out, and they bring them back at the end of the day and charge them up. And everybody that goes on that floor wears one, so we know what's happening. We also are using those for lone worker and some other things, to be able to know where people are, because a lot of times it's individuals walking and doing inspections in these dryer towers and other areas. Go ahead, next slide. So for us, having the device, it is worn on the skin. It has a band that they wear on their upper arm, and everybody, the first questions I get asked all the time is, what about your employees? Do they care? Are they upset over Big Brother watching them? And we explain to them, first and foremost, this will never be used for disciplinary purposes. This is to help you. This is to help protect you. This is so that we know what's going on with you physically. We have had a few significant events in the past, so we were able to point to those and explain what we were trying to accomplish. And these bands work well in our buildings. We've had to put hubs or gateways in the different areas so that we had good signals. A metal dryer tower and metal steps in a building, not the greatest thing for getting signals, but we've put these hubs up. We also have Bluetooth devices for temperature monitoring that we've correlated to our wet bulb globe temperatures. We still do both. We do routine monitoring. People check the wet bulb globe temperature just again to kind of validate that. You have the app, that's the Slate Safety app, but we also have integrated this into our EHS software system too. Next slide. We can see what's happening across all of our operations, in one single dashboard. So we can see what's happening. Somebody gets one of those, alerts, whether it's, the level of exertion, the core body temperature, that HRLV, heart rate. When they get one of those devices and meet the criteria for it, they get an alert. It vibrates and tells them. To be honest with you, we have not had one single heat related event since we've implemented these in our operations. So we were having multiple events a year of people not feeling well, or a little more significant than that. And we relied on individuals to know when to leave the environment, or even the permit to work process, somebody to monitor and make sure that people left. With this device, it vibrates, it tells them, they leave. Supervisors get alerts. So it's been a lot more insightful. So we're pulling people out well before we've needed to do the permit to work, or even when they're doing permit to work, we typically are pulling them out before they get to their times that they're allowed to work. The devices, again, are very specific to the individual. So we know what their biological parameters are at that point in time, and they have to go and rest. And as Zach said, it'll kind of let you know when you've gotten back to your normal temperature or whatever you were alerting for, so that you can go back into the work environment. So we have them cool down, take in fluids, and then we'll release them back once everything drops back down. Next slide. We have all these integrated with our EHS software system. So not only do we get the alerts through text messages and things like that, we also have emails. We do our analytics on the back end. We have a Power BI dashboard where we're trying to look for individuals or things that we should be concerned about, individuals that are having a large number of alerts, so that we can take a look at what's going on. There are situations where you have people that can't work in the environment. They've had a past heat related illness, they have diabetes, they have an underlying medical condition that really prevents them, or we have to pay attention to when they work in the environment. So again, it's just another tool in the toolbox to help us identify and analyze. So we've integrated with our EHS software system. Every single time that alert happens, it generates an email alert that goes into our EHS software system, that goes into our data warehouse, so that we can analyze that data. But in general, I would say that for us, this has been a game changer because it's about real time. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. The lone worker piece is important. The automated triggers, going to our EHS software system, having the Bluetooth devices all over our environment. So we have, real-time monitoring all the time. That's integrated into our TV screens that we have in different places, that goes with all the other operational metrics like OEE and things like that. And then the final piece that we really need to solve is acclimation. What does that physically look like? And we're working with Corey Stringer Institute. There are other research organizations out there, but we're working with them to try and figure out, what does acclimation look like? Can we come up with an algorithm using the data we're already generating to know what it looks like? That's probably the last big thing that we want to be able to solve. So again, that it's personalized and not just based on a standard number of days and time, which works and has been used for a long period of time. But I'd rather see it be more personal in nature, like all the other things that we're doing, with the biological perimeters. From sorry, I was going to mention from a case study standpoint, again, I think it's really important for all of us as we're creating these programs and generating data, using these devices to share this information. And, whether it's NSC or any other organization, the way we learn is from other people. Absolutely steal shamelessly, because, nobody has the right to protect their employees and not protect everybody. So, we absolutely need to figure out how we do this better, and technology can be very, very helpful. Yes, there's a cost associated with it, but it is so much worth the price of admission. Whatever devices you use, they help you before you get to that point, or even knowing you get to that point that you need to pull people out of those work environments. Outdoor work, I can't imagine that it's any easier. All of our challenges are indoor. Outdoor work's got the same issues. So I would say these devices are game changers for everybody if you start embracing them. Okay, Ken.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you, Zach. We will head over into some conclusions. So as you heard from both of our guests today, there's a lot of information certainly that comes into play when it comes to these certain apps and understanding and mitigating heat stress injuries. We, as I mentioned, have our white paper on the website right now. I will share another link here in a moment. Before we get into that, I would love to get into our Q&A session and address some of the questions that are kind of brewing in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop those in there. The first question I see, more of a statement which I think is really relevant, is a statement that says we are required to monitor and record the temperature daily and keep the record for 1 year. So that is a regulation that was started for Cal OSHA specifically. So I wanted to call that out. Another good call out that I see in the chat is also the release of the AIHA heat stress app. Not sure if either of you have had a chance to check that out, but I believe it's a newer resource, only released within the past month or so. But that is another really great resource for looking at the accurate temperature of your work environment. So they take into account, again, that wet bulb globe temperature and some of the different aspects that Zach talked about. One question that I see in the chat that I'm interested in, and Zach, I will perhaps direct this over to you. Nicholas asks, is there an intrinsically safe version? So referring to those devices that can be used, in hazardous environments to mitigate the risk of, ignitions and other hazards. So can you talk briefly maybe about slate safety and how you address that?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Definitely one that we've heard before, and something we're definitely building towards. There's currently actually no vital sign monitor on the market today that is intrinsically safe. We're currently undergoing intrinsically safe certification for Class 1 Div 1 environments, and we expect to have a model available this fall. So we're really looking forward to that, and really being the first kind of vital sign monitor to be able to be used in those hazardous environments, explosive atmospheres, so forth.
Excellent. Something that I wanted to bring up, and this is a question that I will start with Rob and then maybe throw to you, Zach. When we're looking at the different barriers and the different considerations, and we're talking about technologies like wearables, inevitably the first place that we're going to start is the worker. It can be admittedly invasive or seem invasive at the moment if we're collecting these sorts of metrics around heart rate, potentially around how much they're sweating, how much they're working. And there can be a fear amongst workers that data is going to be used punitively, right? To compare them to other workers, to compare productivity, to change wherever it is that they may be working, or to make decisions about their employment. So Rob, can you tell me a little bit, when you first rolled out this tech, were there any worker concerns? How'd you handle those? And if there weren't, what do you attribute to that?
Sure, there are always questions. There will always be questions. We looked at when before we found these, we looked at the capsules and all the other ways to measure core body temperature, and that just wasn't going to work. Whether in a union environment or non-union environment, doesn't matter. People don't want to swallow pills, so I'll say that statement first, and then from a data standpoint, explaining and reassuring people that this data is only being used to monitor from a safety perspective, and that it's not being used for any other purposes. And then from a anonymous standpoint, nobody can see this data besides a few supervisors and administrators. Otherwise, other employees can't see when what other people's metrics are. So there's not that comparison or things like that. We could go into the system and figure out who's wearing what devices. But even when they check them out, the name isn't tagged to the uh, individual number where people can see it. So it's a number and the devices. So you can see on the charts there's device number 50, and you can see the metrics. But we do reassure everybody that it's only used for the work rest ratios and to pull people out of the environment when something's occurring. We do talk about in those 4 micro learnings about there's people that are at higher risk of a heat related illness because of underlying medical conditions, and that this has also helped us identify in a couple of instances people that were susceptible and were having issues. Again, we would have never identified any of these. I think Zach mentioned earlier how many alerts, how many times they've pulled people out. I'll bet that the majority, a significant portion of those are ours. We're pulling out I would say hundreds, if not thousands of people a year out of their work environment, from the exposure, heat exposure before something occurs. So in my mind, it's very, very successful because we're pulling them out of there before they ever reach a point that, we have a concern. So that's the way I would say it's important to, again, be transparent and communicate what you're using for, how you're using it, and show them.
Excellent. Zach, I'll turn it over to you in one moment. I wanted to quickly ask you, Rob, what have the impressions been from workers? What are you hearing from them since you started using this?
We've been thanked by a number of people, and I will say at one facility, we had somebody that ultimately passed away in the work environment, and I will say that, and it wasn't heat related, but I would tell you that heart conditions and other things like that might have been identified if they had been wearing a device. It was before we had the devices. And people remember that and recognize that we might have been able to prevent one of these significant outcomes if, um, we had one of these devices. We absolutely would have identified it before having a heart attack, in the environment. We would have known that a little bit earlier. Would we have prevented it? Who knows? But I think people see that, and we've shared that again. Everybody in safety talks about storytelling. Storytelling is key. You need people. You need to make it personal, and for them to understand this is their coworker. This could be their family member. And in a lot of our facilities, there's multiple generations of family working together in the same facility. So it is about their family besides their work family.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Zach, I'll turn it over to you, kind of on the same subject. Do you hear a lot of input from employers regarding employee privacy concerns or barriers? And what would you say, what lessons have you learned as you've kind of went down this journey of wearables and overcoming some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think Rob answered that, really well already. I think it really takes like a strong culture from a safety perspective to really be able, partner with the worker themselves and really explain to them, this isn't going to be used in a punitive way. It's really there to help you. It's an extra set of eyes to make sure you're safe. I think all the kind of culture perspective, companies like Perigo really kind of lead the way on that. In terms of like the technology, there's definitely different levers that we can pull as a technology provider that allows it to be used in like an anonymous fashion or a deaggregated fashion. And there's lots of vendors out there that kind of have those different levels that they can allow organizations to use.
I see one more question here, and then I think we will wrap up. This looks like sort of a two-pronged question. Maybe the first part is for Rob. Second part, I will throw to you, Zach. Do you see a more accurate temperature using the wet bulb globe temperature for indoor versus outdoor? So is that sort of that's the gold standard for indoor as well?
Yeah, I'll mention, Don mentioned earlier, in one of the in the chat function. I think that outdoor wet bulb globe temperature using temperature humidity and some of the apps, works well. Indoors, there's so many variables in there. I think wet bulb globe temperature is best. I'll defer to somebody that's smarter than I am, but all the stuff that I've read and understand, wet bulb globe temperature is a better indicator of an indoor environment because there's additional parameters that come into play.
Excellent. And there's sort of a part two to that, and then a related question. So I'm going to kind of take a two-prong approach to this, Zach. For indoor monitoring, do you have any recommendations for the best way to measure core body temperature? And can these thresholds be customized? So can you override, let's say, heart rate if for whatever reason they need to?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So for indoor, just like Rob just said, a widget wet bulb globe thermometer is a good way to kind of measure the environment, outside the person, and then of course, kind of as the vendor here from Slate Safety, I have to plug Slate Safety as kind of a good way to measure core body temperature on indoor workers as well. But in terms of making the thresholds customizable, we allow that in our tool. You can make it customized as, Paragos were customized, for example. We're also really proud to be a partner of the ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and we've digitized their 2022 heat stress standard. And so that's available in our tool, and around half of our customers today use that as their standard.
Excellent.
And I'll just add to that. We also have kind of validated all of our set points, for all the alerts. I mentioned earlier, Corey Stringer Institute, we had them audit our program and look at the set points, and, another set of eyes. And I know, Zach has, had conversations with them too, but just another set of eyes looking at it and validating the science of, are these the right places? We're probably pulling people out too early, but I'd rather be pulling them out early than too late. So, we haven't changed those set points for alerts significantly, but, we did validate that we think they're in the right place.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you both. That was a lot of really, really great information. Really great to hear from you, Rob, some of the things that you're working on at Parago, and Zach, of course, to hear about Slate Safety and some of the other technologies available out there. I will quickly plug again our white paper. There will be a link in the chat if you are interested in taking a deeper dive into this. Rob and Zach were both paramount to the development of this paper as well. So I want to give a huge shout out to both of them for sharing their expertise with us, for joining us on today's webinar. And with that being said, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you need or you'd like to talk through this more, please feel free to contact us at work2zero@nsc.org. And before we wrap up, there will be a little poll that pops up once I end the webinar. If you could give us some feedback, it is really helpful to us as we are continuously improving our webinars and our experience. So with that being said, I will end today's webinar. Zach and Rob, thank you again. And thank you to all who attended. And I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.